Tonight on Revolutionaries.
I do believe that creativity is about problem solving. It's far more than expression. And that managing itself should not be thought of as a controlling activity, but as a creative activity.
As a young man, Ed Catmull had a dream, to be an animator and an artist. Today, he heads two of the most legendary animation studios in America, Pixar and Disney. How Catmull got there after a 40-year career and what he learned about the art of managing creative organizations is the subject of tonight's story. Major funding for Revolutionaries is provided by the Intel Corporation.
Let's talk a little bit about your upbringing. We'll get right to the meat of the book, and there's a lot to get to, but I want to talk just a bit about what it was like to grow up and have a sense that you wanted to be an artist, and the people who inspired you and the people you thought about when you were young.
Well, this is in the 50s and in Utah, so it was a very safe environment. And I didn't realize it until later, but none of the adults ever talked about the war. So it's really only 7 or 8 years after this major catastrophic event, and they had also lived through the Depression. So it was like this big social earthquake, and now it was calm, and they wanted it calm. So this was the environment I came into, and on television there is Walt Disney, and there's the iconic figure of Einstein, and for a kid growing up in the 50s, like these are the two stars. And they were cool, and I still think of them as cool.
You say in the book that you were that guy who was always sleeping on the floor at the computer lab just to get some more hours on the mainframe. There are people here who went through that same thing, I think. What was the magic for you of computing as you were experiencing it in the university at that time?
Well, I returned to graduate school. I had graduated with 2 degrees, one in physics and one in computer science. But it was clear that with computer science that we were close to the frontier, whereas physics, it was a long haul to get to the frontier. And I always had the sense that it was like being at an Easter egg hunt, and I was at the front of the line and they just cut the ribbon. So that was what computer science was. And it was my good fortune to be at Utah, where, funded by ARPA, they were focusing on computer graphics. It was also one of the first of the 4 nodes of the internet, and image processing. So when I took that first class, in fact, I was intending to go into computer languages, but as soon as I looked and said, we can make pictures with this, then it was just like a light switch. It's okay, everything moved over to picture making. And they were crude, they were black and white, made out of polygons, but you could see the potential there. Like something was going to happen.
And then you had an amazing environment there, right? Ivan Sutherland, the Dean of Computer Graphics, running the program. And not everybody here would know this, but your classmates at that time included Jim Clark, founder of Silicon Graphics and then Netscape, John Warnock, co-founder of Adobe, and Alan Kay, the wizard of Xerox PARC, and you. So what was it like to be in that environment at that point?
Well, I would say at that time, I knew it was a special environment. We were funded by ARPA. There was very little bureaucracy. Now, the truth is, I didn't know what bureaucracy was. But I did recognize that we had a really good deal. They were letting us go off and solve problems there. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed all of my classmates there. It was an invigorating environment where we were all supporting each other. And I found the environment very inspirational. It was, and for me, it was the kind of thing I wanted to keep wherever I went. And while we've gone through modified forms, I'd have to say, it started at the University of Utah, and it was funded by ARPA. And there was something enlightened, I think really enlightened about the program, which I recognized at the time.
Now let's flash way forward from all of that. I just wanted people to get a sense of how you came to dream of animation and then get into computer graphics and be associated with so many amazing people who were there at Utah at the time with you. Let's move forward to the point at which you go to work for George Lucas. You'd been in New York, you'd had a group that you were working with, you'd been working in the field, always in the area of computer graphics and animated filmmaking. And then you, at his request, you come out to California, you talk to them. This was right after Star Wars had come out, right?
Yeah, Star Wars was in '77, and I started in '79. So we'd had this program at New York Tech. We were there for about 5 years. And I had a theory about how to manage a group based upon the fact that I didn't actually want to manage. I wanted to be in charge, but I didn't want to manage. So I came up with these theories about how to have a flat organization and the kind of people to hire. And the first person was Alvy Ray Smith, who's here and one of the co-founders of Pixar. You know, at first I'm a little nervous because here's a guy who's like really smart. And I don't know, like, should I be threatened by this? But I had the feelings. But I did the right thing, and I learned something from it. And when George came along and wanted to bring high technology into the film industry, it was a time for, I think, looking back about what worked and what didn't work. And my feeling at the time was about 2/3 of these theories worked, because we had a really nice environment there, some really great stuff happened, and about 1/3 of the ideas were a complete crock. And so I went forward, and to this day I still think, well, that's kind of the way it works. About 2/3 of the ideas work and 1/3 are bad ideas. And I say that because a lot of people have these 80-20 rules and 90-10 rules. I think that's too optimistic. That what it means is we're right more than we think we are. Because if I actually think about it, I think, well, actually more like 80% of my stuff was right, except that I later learned that some of the stuff I thought was wrong, was wrong. So I just said, okay, you've got to build into it the fact that more stuff is wrong than you think is wrong.
There's something about the way you got the job at Lucas that I want to pause on, because I think it says a lot about these ideas about openness and the free flow of ideas that we're going to get to in a minute that are so much a foundation of what you write about. They asked you a question.
Yes, George had this big success with one film, and he was the only person in the industry willing to take a gamble. But Star Wars was a worldwide phenomenon. And there were other people who would have liked to have gotten this kind of job, right? I mean, okay, George Lucas, the only guy in the film industry willing to fund computer graphics, how cool would that be? So he had somebody going out interviewing various people. And so the question that he asked me is, who else should we talk to? So
For the job that you wanted.
Yeah, for the job that I was applying for.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, well, here are all the other good people that could do this. And so I listed their names. And it turns out they'd already been talking to all those people, and they had asked them all the same question. And they wanted the job, so they didn't give any names. So they gave me the job. You know, and around that time, to be honest, too, we were, it was a similar sort of thing where the other people wanted to make advances in this field, and the feeling was if you come up with an idea, you would try to hold it and not let your competitors know about it. And this is the early days of SIGGRAPH. And the view that we took was, we're so far away that any idea we come up with will be only a minor part of what we do. And therefore, our approach was we published freely everything that we did. And the result was we engaged in the community and developed friendships which last to this day. And those that were secretive actually weren't drawing in the best people. The result is we could hire the best people because we engaged in the community, and that was the big win. And indeed, most of those ideas were, some of them, they've been bypassed by better ideas since then. So who cares what the original ideas were? It was really that process of getting people who would buy in and support each other.
So partly for this rapid march, this reason of the rapid march of technology, you're talking about the improvement of processing power and so forth, and partly for financial reasons, George Lucas decides not to continue with this computer business within Lucasfilm. And in 1985, as you guys are looking collectively for a solution, you meet Steve Jobs for the first time, and a conversation begins about this. Can you talk a little bit about how that happened?
Well, Alan Kay introduced us, and he was pretty interested, and then he disappeared. And we learned later why. It was because he was involved in this thing which led to his leaving Apple. And then he met with us, and Alvy and I went down to his place in Woodacre, Woodside, or
Woodside.
Woodside, there we go. Woodacres in Marin. And basically he outlined a plan in which we would be the seed for forming a new computer company. And that was not what we wanted to do, because we wanted to go down a path using graphics. So we declined, and then he went off and formed Next. And we were going through this traumatic experience of spinning out from Lucasfilm. And coincidentally, SIGGRAPH was in San Francisco that year and ran into Steve. And so at that point, we reopened the conversation, but he'd already formed Next, so now he was willing to buy us on terms that were closer to what we wanted, which was to initially sell this hardware as part of our path towards moving in a graphics direction.
So in 1986, you get together, and Pixar, as we now know it today, begins to take shape.
Yeah, so we started a company, and so I'm the president of the company, and I've never been the president. I don't know what the hell I'm doing. We have no marketing people, and at that time we had no manufacturing people.
You're sort of behind the eight ball for a marketing and manufacturing company at that point, aren't you?
Well, and to make it even better, Steve's experience had actually been with consumer products. So they'd been selling apples and so forth. He had no instinct for a high-end product, how to sell it, how to make it, or whatever. So basically, none of us knew what in the world we were doing. And at that time of Steve's life, he was in the more difficult phase. I'll talk more about changes in him later, but
yes.
Some of his characteristics are well known, and we saw that. So that was part of who he was at the time. And even looking back on it, here was a guy who'd been sort of thrown out of his kingdom, and he had his ambitions and his own desires and ego that were there. So the result of this was that starting off as a company, we didn't know what to do. We had to learn very quickly. So we had to learn about manufacturing. We brought in marketing people and build up a sales force, and made a lot of mistakes along the way. A couple of them fatal. Because in fact, at one point, we actually did, Steve bought back Pixar, and then we restarted it. So, and we sold off the business because we couldn't do it. But basically, we stayed together through the failures. And usually what happens is when a group falls apart, then the experience that is accrued goes with the people outside, and then somebody else benefits from it. So you could look at Silicon Valley as the big example of that, of where all this knowledge from companies coming and going has risen the entire industry up. In our case, because the group stayed together, then we also benefited in the end from having stayed together and learned things together.
I want to begin to introduce then, just that very point. There's some themes that are very large in the book. And the book is fundamentally an approach to managing creativity and getting the best out of an organization, any organization where creativity is important, and that's almost every organization. You had been through a lot of difficulty and things that were not working well when you were trying to be a manufacturing and marketing company. What had you begun to learn as the guy at the top about that process and getting through those difficulties that begins to shape the ideas we're going to talk about in a minute?
Well, there were two parts to it. One of them is that I knew that we were doing original things, and there's something exciting about the fact that you're coming up with new discoveries and inventions, and that group has got that built into them, the way they think about it. I also knew that we didn't have all the pieces together, that we were still learning. But at the same time, I had friends at other companies here, at Sun and Silicon Graphics and various other companies. And we had a relationship with Disney because we were writing the software for them. So one of the things to do was just in watching them, it's like, what are they doing that makes them work, and what do they do that makes them go off the rails? And at the time, I was struck by the number of companies that would do something which I thought was good and clever and an indication of creativity at every level. These were smart people. They had great engineers. They had great problems. They had good customers and good marketing. And all those pieces came together. Then they would go public, and then a significant number of them would do something which is foolish, and at the time foolish.
And you could see that as an observer.
Yeah, and I mean, the one that a lot of people are familiar with was Silicon Graphics buying Cray Computer. And I'm not inside, I'm just at the outside looking in. But it was clear, and it wasn't just to me, like there are a number of people who are saying, okay, that's actually the wrong direction to be going. All right, so it wasn't as if I had this remarkable insight that nobody else could see. All right, there's a lot of people saying, like, what are they thinking? But that's a real question. You don't stop at that point and say, what are they thinking? It's like, well, wait a minute, these are really smart people. If they're missing something there, then there's something going on that's detrimental to them, and these smart people are missing it. I wonder if we're ever successful, the same thing happened to us. Well, we weren't successful, so it was an academic question. But then we watched Disney, and Disney had this remarkable rise when Walt Disney was alive, and he was the primary driver to take animation to where it was, but he didn't conceive of the company without him, and when he died, then you had a bunch of people wandering around saying, what would Walt do? And it was very unhealthy for them. So they went downhill, and then they had this forced takeover where Roy Disney and the Bass brothers came in, and then brought in Eisner and Katzenberg and Tom Schumacher and various other people to build the company. And they got interested in animation, which was what Roy wanted, and they made Little Mermaid, which is this giant success for the time. And then they made the first film that went through the computer, where every frame ran through the computer, but it was not a big success, but it looked good. So nobody remembers it. But their next film, they used that newfound technology with the way they were thinking about making films, and they made Beauty and the Beast, then Aladdin, then Lion King. So these were essentially 4 culture-changing films, and then they went downhill. And they went way downhill. Now, I'm thinking, okay, these are really smart people there. They're very creative. What's going on? And it just became a really, again, academic question, like something bizarre is happening there that they're missing. And we finally got a chance, because of Disney, to make Toy Story, which happened in '91. And in '91, now, we had a group that was figuring it out, and none of us had ever made a film before.
So on Thanksgiving Day, 1995, Toy Story is released to the public. It opens #1 at the box office, and Steve Jobs had said, if we make $75 million, we break even. If we make $100 million, we make a little money, and if we make more than that, then we all make quite a bit of money, meaning Disney and Pixar. It made more than $350 million. And you found yourself having achieved the goal that you've been working on for almost 20 years, which was making the first completely computer animated movie ever. And you write in the book, now that goal had been reached, and I had what can only be described as a hollow, lost feeling. Now, that's not the normal reaction of a studio executive whose movie opens #1 and makes $350 million at the box office. So why did you have that feeling?
Well, so for 20 years, basically we operated in a framework of having this goal, and we had these distractions and detours in trying to get there. And there was the elation that came with it coming out, as well as calls from a lot of colleagues, because they knew this was our dream for a long period of time, including calls from people who also wanted to do it, so essentially thanking us for succeeding because it gave them an opportunity to also do something in this arena. And so you go through this elation for a certain period of time. And I should say, at the same time, we also went public.
Right.
So now we're a public company. We were the biggest IPO of the year. It was bigger than Netscape. But if now what? Okay, well, if we've got this big, long goal, then what's the next goal? To do the same thing over again? Mm-hmm. And so that was one part of the problem. It's like, oh, okay, what's the next goal? Because repeating myself just didn't feel like a good thing to do. There was another thing which I felt, and I never told anybody about it, and that was, as we reached this goal, I knew that a lot of people had contributed. I knew the contributions obviously from John and Steve, because they're very public, but there were a lot of technical people, a lot of artists involved in this that were part of making this happen. But the question I asked of myself was, how much of this was me? And even though knowing that a lot of people involved with it, I still had this feeling like, how much is me? So I had these two background things. Now, meanwhile, I was really busy because we're running a company. We started off on the next film, the second and the third film. We've got all sorts of issues as we grow. So there's a lot to go there, but it didn't feel like it had a direction to it. And it was during that year that I looked back on what it took to get there. And I realized there was this gigantic question of what goes wrong with these companies when they're successful.
It's just the question we were talking about, you were asking 10 years earlier with companies you were observing, seeing these very things happen to.
So now we're successful, and as we start in the second film, I discovered that there was one group of people who were the production people we had brought up from LA who were deeply unhappy and didn't know if they wanted to go on to the next film, if they want to continue with the company. The artists and the technical people were just rolling up their sleeves ready to go. But the production people said, you know, we're treated like second-class citizens here. And I didn't see it. Now, in my view, I'm looking, because I know these companies get blind to these things, and we've got formally this open door policy, anybody can talk, and sure enough, if people had complaints on the technical artistic side, they did complain. Mm. So you have these things and you address them because you know about them. This group didn't complain because in that world they came out of, they were short-term gigs, and complaining actually would cost you future jobs. You didn't say anything. And the other was, working on the film was actually history making. Everybody in this last year knew they were making history. So there was an excitement that goes with making history. And so I looked back and I thought, okay, so what's happened is, because they're making history, they're willing to shut up and not say what they're unhappy about, and they're hiding it from us. It's only when we go on to the second film that they reveal that they feel this way. So I was stunned, because I had missed it. And I went around to the artists and the technical people to see what they felt about these the production people, and sure enough, they felt they were second-class citizens. This was not something they were imagining. They thought they were sand in the gears. So I had two problems. One is, why did I miss it? And the second one, what was the problem itself? And the problem was that the production managers had so much at stake, they were trying to control every aspect of it. So everything had to go through the proper channels. And once you realized that, we could then work on trying to disentangle the communication structure from the organizational structure. Because what we do is very organized, but anybody needs to be able to talk to anybody anytime, and that's what true open doors should mean. It shouldn't just mean that the president's door is open, it means anybody can talk. And the second thing I could see was that there were all sorts of things that were causing people to hide it, and I had to look for it. And there was something about that. So, okay, this now is an interesting problem. If I've seen these other companies fall apart, can we tackle this problem? Can we make a sustainable culture that doesn't fall apart? So that became the new goal. It was like the next 10-year goal, is how do we find these problems before they kill us? The other thing that happened by the end of the year was I realized that the question of how much of this was me was a bad question to ask. But the reason I bring this up is I look at a lot of successful groups and I know that they've asked the question, they'll never admit it, but they came up with the wrong answer.
Starting with that question, how did I miss it? That's the framing question of the entire book. And you talk about the things that you found to be necessary inside Pixar as a creative organization, and you draw a lot of lessons that can be learned by any organization. I want to go through a few of those now. You've got inside Pixar a very special process for working through the creative process that begins with what you call the brain trust. It's not simply that there are people sitting around a table called your brain trust. It's the way that they've learned to work together under a very important culture that you put together. And I wonder if you can just take us through what that means to Pixar and now Disney.
So the brain trust was something that was formed, I'd almost say accidentally, and later one of them dubbed it the brain trust. But it was the first 5 people working on the film, and they were funny, focused, intense, and when they would argue, it was about the problem. It was never personal, and you felt that in the room. And it was highly productive. And so you had this group which worked really well together, and John, as the director, made the final decision. Now, as we progressed and we got more films going, we added people to the brain trust, and we recognized we had something special there. So we thought we would try to replicate it in a couple of other areas. And one of them was in the technical areas. So we had a lot of strong technical people who were friends with each other, they appreciated each other, and they would get together, have discussions, but it was never at the same level as it was with the brain trust. So one of the questions was, what is the difference between these two groups? What we discovered was we had not given that group any authority, and they still don't have any authority, to override the director. Now, the reason it took us a while to figure this out is because originally John was the director. So the guy making the final decision is in the room. But when you get other directors in there, then John would not override the director. Now, the reason this is important is that the director is coming in to present their work to a body of peers who are also filmmakers. So this is not some executive thing on high. These are peers who are giving notes. By not having authority in that room, it allows the director to listen, and that's the biggest thing we want. It turns out that directors, and this is true with a lot of people in a project, get so lost in it that they lose objectivity. And you want to be able to see the truth from your peers who can point things out to you and be open to it.
In fact, that's one of the really clarifying statements for me that you make in the book, which is that everyone working on any kind of a creative endeavor at any point gets lost in it. They just get lost. They're starting with something completely new and they're trying to create or work with a team to create their way out of it, and they all get lost. You've made that getting lost process explicit as part of your innovation process, which I think is fascinating.
You want to get at the truth, all right? You want people to say what they think, and it turns out that's a hard thing. So the next list of things was to address was, as the group got bigger, is why would people not tell the truth, and or why wouldn't they be candid? And I use the word candid, and I try to make a point of it instead of honesty, because honesty is too loaded. Like, well, of course you should be honest. But if you discuss it in terms of candor, you can say, well, you know, sometimes I'm not going to be candid because I don't want to look foolish. You know, I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want to embarrass somebody else, or I want to impress somebody. There are people who actually signal, powerful people in the room, who signal that they don't want to hear the truth. So you've got these real human dynamics, some of which the people aren't even aware of, that are going on. And so the way we began to look at it is that my job, and Jim Morris, who's the general manager, when we go to these brain trust meetings, once in a while we'll say something about the story because it's kind of fun to do that. It's actually not our job. The job is to look at the dynamics because they're focused on the problem. And every once in a while, especially if you've got a difficult problem and a large group, then the thing will go off the rails. So if I were to look at this over its history, then usually the group operates very well, and that's what it shows in the films. Once in a while, it completely melts down, doesn't work at all. And then we have to reassemble, and typically with a smaller group, to change the dynamics in the room.
What does it look like when something goes off the rails at Pixar?
Well, they're giving comments. People are getting defensive. You're not making progress, and the conversation wanders around in various places.
Because you're making a lot of small movies. Your process is not, there's this moment when an entire film is released to everyone. This is like writing chapters in a book almost, and people are reviewing it as they go along.
Yeah, although it's less like chapters, and it's more like the mock-up of a product. And so we do the first mock-up, and the first mock-up doesn't work at all. All right, it's a disaster. And in fact, John uses the phrase that it's the worst thing he's ever seen. So it's...
That must make everyone feel really good.
Yeah, but the thing is, that's what you get used to it.
Sure.
And then you go back and you make another pass at it. And the reason for these note sessions is to give you some insight as to what works and what doesn't work. And typically what happens is the film will slowly get better, sometimes have a setback, but will start to converge. So that's the optimal path. And it doesn't always happen that way. So sometimes it's very painful. But the key concept, which is important, is to realize that when we start, it doesn't work right. And it leads to, for me, to one of the fundamental distinctions that I try to make, and I think it happens in a lot of environments. And it came out of a phrase which I first heard at Disney when they were making their successful films. And that is, they used the phrase, you had to feed the beast. And they weren't using it in a derogatory sense. They were using it in the sense that here's this mass of people. It's difficult to organize and control all that because a lot of things are going on. There's a lot of creativity in this group. And it's the group that generates the product that goes out and creates the revenue for the company. So it's really important that it be run well. It's also where your costs are. So if you don't have anything to put into this production pipeline, then your costs go through the roof and you don't get anything out of it. So organizing it and getting the process right then becomes very important. All right. And that isn't just in the film industry. If you think about a lot of industries, but like print, television, right? Then you've got to feed something. You have to keep stuff coming in. Now, the difficulty is the front end is a different kind of thing. So what is the front end?
That moment when there's nothing but a blank screen up there and there's nothing on it at all.
Yeah, so what, you want to generate this original idea, so how do people think about it? And a lot of people would think, I would like to go into a studio and watch them make a film. So what's the mental imagery they've got? And so I've been trying to think of the analogy, and it's probably something like thinking about Brad Pitt when he was a little boy. And, he's probably a little bratty and snot-nosed and rebellious, and ultimately grows up to be this attractive movie star. Okay, but what do you do if the baby's ugly? And so here's the thing. All of our babies are ugly. All right, and this is the difficult concept, because people have a notion that you have a process and you start off with an idea, so you got the lone inventor idea, and they do this and they go through this stuff. And it doesn't acknowledge the god-awful mess that happens in getting there. And since the thing is a mess, then how do you judge the team? Because if your metric is that, oh, this group is good because they do good stuff, well, I just told you the stuff doesn't work. So what do you do for that team? So how do you judge them? You actually have to protect them. So there's a period of protection. It can't be forever, or they get lost. And it can't be too short of a time, or you don't allow things to develop. But you do have to protect this thing. And this entity, because it's different, is vulnerable, because you've got this great big organized thing that needs to get fed. So what happens in a company when the founders retire or die or get hit by a bus? Well, I guess that's dying too. Or move on.
Right.
So at that point, they have to replace them. And the normal thing is, you say, well, who are the most organized people in the company? So they're the people that run the beast. So you put everything over them, and they bring their values, which are process values, to the front end. And so while they've been trying to make the process more efficient and trying to get the cost down and so forth, they then come at that front end, and this is what happened at Disney, with, okay, guys, we've got a schedule to meet. You need to do this. This is all the steps we're going to go through. You go through each of these steps, and we're going to then pass off onto the beast. And all of a sudden, you find you've got films that aren't any good, but they're organized to be made well.
Yeah. Okay. And you call that process protecting the ugly baby.
Yes.
In the book. That's an important part of your mantra. We always get education questions, and I'm always so happy when we do. And here's one. Have you considered the implications of using your ideas about creativity and innovation to reform the public education system and to reintroduce our youth to the excitement of collaboration and learning?
Well, I've thought a lot about it. I've already mentioned some of my feelings, and I try to cover more about that in terms of art and the implications for that, and and I think the tragic removal of it from our school system. But even beyond that, there is something. The analogy for me is the beast, because they're doing important things, but they're very process-oriented. And they like to measure things and think that measuring is capturing a lot. Now, we do a lot of measurement, but my belief is most things are actually hidden from us and we can't see them. So we do measure in order to get a picture, but it's only a small picture. So if I think about education, okay, well, we've got testing and so forth as a way of measuring how schools are doing, but that's actually only a tiny picture of what's going on. And some of the theories about how you have people work hard and how you get them excited are replaced by theories about measuring our education system. And I think it goes in the wrong direction. It's too long of a thing for a brief answer, but I do think there are a lot of concepts, in particular with creativity, where, or with the notion of failure and mistakes, where some of the concepts that apply in some industries do not belong in other industries or in the education system.
We talked about the brain trust, and that got attention from several people. This is a good question about that. What's the best advice you would give to someone looking to build their own brain trust?
Well, I think a lot of companies, when they start off, when they've got that small spirit, that a lot of them succeed because they put together the equivalent of a group that's trying to solve a problem together. And one of the things I try to do in this book is I don't try to define creativity because I think of it as very broad. And I don't even try to address how to make groups more creative. In fact, if you were to ask most audiences if they had really good ideas for how to make people more creative, only a few people would raise their hands. But if you would ask people, what can you do to make people feel bad or hold up or not say what they think? Then everybody would raise their hands because they all know and have seen those things. All right, that's the low-hanging fruit. So the issue for me is not when a group gets together and has that wonderful experience. It's the fact that having gone off in that wilderness and discovering that stuff, they then move to a place where they're no longer there. And that's when these groups fall apart. They know how to do things, or they've become the experts or the brilliant geniuses that got there. And that way of thinking evolved from a good place and then it actually devolved into this process-oriented thing without recognizing that it happened. And for me, it's the fundamental issue. It's really trying to address the delusions that all of us get and that we all have. I still have. I mean, there's stuff going on. I can't see it.
Yeah. It's part of what you called the hidden in your book, isn't it? There's an explicit chapter called The Hidden. And you say, if you can't uncover these unseen things, these things that are hidden and you need to get more deeply into, you're probably not qualified to lead. It's a very strong statement.
Well, I mean, first of all, I believe that we should have introspection. And I believe it's individuals, but I also think it's companies. Now, that doesn't mean you spend all the time standing around looking at your navel, either at a personal level or at a company level. But every once in a while, it's time to sit back and really try to think about what you're doing. Because most of our activities are outward facing, and they need to be. So that's the bulk of our time is outward facing. There should be some amount of time which is inward facing, which is a wholly different activity than being outward facing. And that's what people don't understand. And because they don't do it, they have a misconception of what it means to be introspective. So they may even think they're being introspective and they're not doing it because they're doing outward facing just in a different way. But if you do the introspection, then there's another part of it, which is how do you integrate what you've learned or what you've come up with your outward facing. So for me, you have to be aware of the breadth of that. And when it comes to things that are hidden, I believe there are several levels of that. There are things having to do with our position, where people won't tell us certain things because we're perceived to be powerful or important or whatever the reason is. There are also complexities of life, but it goes on into things because there's chance in the world and there are hidden interconnections that under no circumstances any of us can ever possibly see. And that's there. It's part of our lives. And in one sense, we know that, and yet it's so complex that we can identify the fact that chance is part of our lives and that things are interconnected, and yet not connect any dots together about how that might affect the way we perceive our judgment process. And what it does is it closes us down to alternative viewpoints. In fact, one of my favorite examples has to do with a great military philosopher, Donald Rumsfeld. And he had this thing you remember a while ago about the known knowns, the known unknowns, and then the unknown unknowns. Well, okay, so we get the concept, and we all understand that the that the known unknowns are much bigger than the known knowns. So we all accept the fact that we may not know surgery or plumbing or electrical stuff or law. And there's this whole big pile of things that we don't know, and we're actually comfortable with that in general, and we'll associate with people to solve those problems when we need them. Okay, so the unknown unknowns is almost like, oh, every once in a while you get hit with one of those. All right, so the question is, how big is the unknown unknowns compared to these others? All right, well, we already know the known unknowns is much bigger than the known unknowns. How much bigger is the unknown unknown? Well, it is, the other is like a teeny dot in this other. But we don't know it, so we can't conceive of it. And by not having some awareness of the magnitude of what we don't see, we can close ourselves off to opportunities.
If you had said Buzz Lightyear was on the cover of the book because it was your favorite character, I wouldn't ask you this next question. But since you didn't say that, I'm going to ask you, who's your favorite Toy Story character?
Well, okay, first of all, I'm going to give the obvious answer, which is like you would never say who your favorite child is. Okay. But there's actually a deeper thing there. And that is, the movies to me mean something different than they do to other people. So when I see each one of these, I don't actually see it in the same sense. I'm aware of the issues, the smoking piles of rubble sometimes along the way, and the pain. You know, if somebody doesn't succeed at directing and they're removed from it, then they're put in the position because they were talented, good people. The fact that they couldn't go all the way through, you want them to continue with the company, but it's humiliating for them. So you make a gamble on somebody, and if it doesn't come through, then you actually have ended up hurting them. And yet at the same time, you have to take gambles on people and to go into that position. So all of those are mixed into my feelings about them.
All right, one last question from the audience, and then I'm going to ask the last question, and then you're going to do a little reading, which we always love to have. What was the hardest film to complete from a teamwork perspective, and why?
What was the hardest to complete? I mean, the truth is they do vary. I mean, they're all hard, and so actually when you say that, it implies somebody might work less than others. But what makes something hard actually is the pain. It's not the amount of work. So I've mentioned Toy Story 2 because it was a painful, difficult thing, and but it was also a defining moment for the studio. But here's the reason I'm hedging on this, is that defining moment for our studio, which I remember well and the people that lived through it remember well, is now in our history. So for the new people at Pixar, it's in our mythical past. So as we go through problems, their expectation is that Pixar is smooth running. And so they come and they find that, oh no, we have all kinds of problems. So in fact, every once in a while we have a meltdown, and what you want is like the middle-sized meltdown, because you finish it and you learn a lot in the process. But once in a while you do a restart, and it's just, you know, very difficult. But in doing so, and in solving the problems, those problems are problems that we didn't have before, because we do learn from the past, but so we don't repeat the same mistakes, or knowingly repeat the same mistakes. Sometimes if we repeat them, it's we realize our theory was 1/3 incorrect. So we'll go back and modify them. So, but we'll miss these things. And so we'll make mistakes. Well, who fixes them? So what we don't want is for someone looking at us and saying, oh, you guys fix it, like it's your job. So the thing I'm really proud of Pixar is that when we have these problems, is the meetings are, what do we do to fix this thing? And so they own the problem. So the films that are hard or really difficult, you actually want some once in a while. Now, at the time, people don't want them. But I'm fairly optimistic, because as long as we've got them and we address them, and we also stop something that isn't working, then that group has the experience of realizing that we do have these standards we hold to, and that we can solve the problem and we can be okay and we'll be stronger for it. But now it's their history. It's not the history that I went through that they didn't see.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very forward-looking way of looking at that question. And the forward-looking nature of you and your idea of leadership comes through in the book time and again. I think that's one of the best and most remarkable things about it. So let me ask you my final question, which is, what do you hope will happen as the result of your having written this book?
Well, I mean, the industry itself is very small, and it's not trying to teach other people how to make movies. I do believe that creativity is about problem solving. It's far more than expression. And that managing itself should not be thought of as a controlling activity, but as a creative activity. And the reason we make films is we want to touch culture in a positive way. And for me, it's just a driving force, is can I do something which actually has a positive effect? And like movies, the fact is you don't touch some people. Some miss it, and some it connects with. And my hope is that I connect with some people who are open to it and make a difference.
That's great. We have a short reading, which you've agreed to do. We always like to have our authors read in their own voices here. And so I'm just going to open the book to that little point and hand it to you.
My goal has never been to tell people how Pixar and Disney figured it all out, but rather to show how we continue to figure it out every hour of the day, how we persist. The future is not a destination, it is a direction. It is our job then to work each day to chart the right course and make corrections when inevitably we stray. I already can sense the next crisis coming around the corner. Incidentally, it did happen. We must accept it, just as we accept the weather. Uncertainty and change are life's constants, and that's the fun part. The truth is, as challenges emerge, mistakes will always be made, and our work will never be done. We will always have problems, many of which are hidden from our view. We must work to uncover them and assess our own role in them, even if doing so means making ourselves uncomfortable. When we come across a problem, we must marshal all our energies to solve it. If those assertions sound familiar, that's because I used them to kick off this book. There's something else that bears repeating here. Unleashing creativity requires that we loosen the controls, accept risk, trust our colleagues, work to clear the path for them, and pay attention to everything that creates fear. Doing all these things won't necessarily make the job of managing a creative culture easier, but ease isn't the goal. Excellence is.
Please join me in thanking Ed Catmull. Technology meets creativity at Pixar's incredible campus across the bay from San Francisco. There are hundreds of stories like this at the Computer History Museum. Join us next time for the Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.